Hi everyone, I'm Ashley with Atlassian, and I am excited today to welcome Anthony Kosner from Dropbox. He's the innovation content lead there, and we're going to chat a little bit today about some neuroscience and attention. So personally, Anthony, I got to tell you, we were chatting a little bit before the call, and I'm kind of a nerd, like I'm a closet psychology, neuroscience nerd. So I personally am super excited about this conversation. Welcome.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ashley.
So attention seems to be a big topic in the world of work today. As we think about it, as we talk about work, we're constantly talking about attention. So what does the latest science say and the research say about how we're spending our attention and how we could do it better?
Well, I think the first thing is to kind of try to understand that the brain is always paying attention and always not paying attention to a lot of stuff. I mean, the brain has one big job, which is to resolve uncertainty. And that's actually a really difficult job.
Yeah.
So we're actually asking our brains all the time to do this really difficult job. And when I first started looking at the neuroscience behind this, I was interested in this idea of digital overwhelm, this idea that we're just inundated with all of this stuff and oh, this must be such a problem for our brains.
Yeah.
But that's what our brains do. And that's what our brains have always done. I mean, the job of being a human being is very tough. There's all of this stimulus all the time, and we're trying to sort it out.
Yeah.
And so I think that the first place you have to go is to keep in mind that the brain is juggling all these balls all the time, and that's okay. That's really what it does.
Yeah.
The problem is, you're juggling 27 balls and then the 28th ball comes and you drop all the balls, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of the problem. So what your brain is trying to do is keep you from getting to that point. And we can help. I mean, that's the real message is that once you have a better understanding of what your brain's doing, it is easier to understand how to give your brain a break, and especially how to give other people's brains a break. Because
that's really interesting, right? Because from a conscious perspective, that's what we do with our to-do lists and our calendars and our notification, mute or turning on and off, right? Putting our phones on silent. But I can't put your phone on silent. I don't know what's happening off the frame for you. It could be, something crazy could be happening. So I want to dig in on that a little bit about the other people's brains, because I feel like for the most part, people do a pretty good job coping with their own brains, but the other people's brains, that's the wild card. How do we do that?
Yeah, well, and it turns out that most of what we're thinking about when we're sort of thinking in our heads, most of what we're thinking about is other people and how other people are going to respond to things. So the social component of our brain is huge. And that's one of the things that really distinguishes humans. I mean, language to start, but then just this interest in other people and this need to position ourselves in relation to other people. I think what's happened is that, yes, we have all these to-do lists and we have all these apps and we have all these things, but what we don't have are general social agreements with each other of how to use them and ways of structuring information for each other to help other people resolve their uncertainty. And, we think about this maybe particularly if you're a manager, that it's your job to resolve the uncertainty for the people who report to you. But the truth is, as team members too, we're constantly in a position either of dumping our uncertainty on other people or helping to clarify things for other people. And so I think that a big part of the social dimension of all of this is understanding not only that you have a brain that's trying to, resolve uncertainty with all this stuff, but so is everybody else.
Yeah.
And I think that when you look at how effective teams work, you see that effective teams really support each other in these lateral ways, which is very much like what goes on in the brain, that it's not all top down down. Like a lot of what's going on in the brain is very lateral, and many things going on at the same time, or many things going on at more or less the same time. I mean, I think this is one of the big things that we've learned recently in brain imaging. I've had a number of conversations with Carl Friston, who's the guy who invented all of the technology between fMRI, brain imaging.
Wow.
And what's really interesting there is that most of what you see in fMRI is the stuff that's all happening at the same time. There's a concept in neuroscience that neurons that fire together wire together. And that's a very, Donald Hebb's, in the 40s invented that.
Yeah.
And that's a very basic principle, but not all at exactly the same time. There's a lot of stuff that happens that is asynchronous. And in fact, one of the big breakthroughs 20 years ago that Friston made was to understand that the asynchronous wiring was actually even more significant than the synchronous stuff, but the synchronous stuff was what you were seeing directly in the fMRI. And so he developed over the past 20 years these ways of modeling what you're seeing in the brain imaging in order to infer these other asymmetric, these other asynchronous connections that are going on. And so, this has very direct relevance to how we work with each other. Because a lot of times, we want to have everyone together in the meeting, right? This is a great synchronous experience where we're all getting the same thing at the same time. But that can also be very inefficient.
Right.
And so figuring out what can be asynchronous and really pushing on the asynchronous stuff that you can, both for your team and also for yourself, is really the secret to attention. It's really the secret to attention is to be able to say, when do I need these people for us all to be together, for us to be having a live conversation? And when, in fact, is it better if we all go off, as it is now, to our own apartments or houses, sometimes with screaming children, sometimes without? That's a whole other part of the conversation, is that reality that everybody has right now. But trying to figure out both, what do I need for myself? What does the team need in order to function well? How can we all be aligned on this thing that whatever organization we're working for is working towards? And for a lot of that, I've had some conversations, wonderful conversations with Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School, who's done all this research on psychological safety in teams. And the big thing with psychological safety in teams is that people have to feel like they can be honest. People have to feel like if they raise their hand and say, I don't think this is going to work, that they're not going to be treated as someone who's a downer, right? But rather someone who has a genuine concern that we should all pay attention to.
Well, and I think I want to dig in on that a little bit, especially now that we are all working from home. And how do you create that sense of trust? I know there's a lot of teams that are maybe a little bit scared of using video because they feel like, what if my kid comes in, or you can hear the lawnmower that's happening at my neighbor's next door, right? How do you create that sense of trust and rapport, particularly if you're a new team, right? We're still hiring people. We've got people onboarding who have never met some of their colleagues in person. So you can't just say, we'll just rely on the trust you already built. How do you do that in this completely virtual environment? Both, yes, turn on your video, but in Slack notifications, or in, when you're sharing files, or whenever you're sending emails, like, how do you build that psychological safety in this kind of new distributed workforce that we're all dealing with now?
Yeah, no, and I talked to Amy about that recently. And, first of all, teams that already have a strong sense of psychological safety, yes, that translates pretty well, and that will do us well for some number of months while we're in quarantine. For teams that don't have that, or for new teams that are spinning up, I think for existing teams that don't have that, it's maybe tougher, because there probably are some issues there that aren't being addressed. That if anything, this is really going to make those things apparent quicker.
Yeah.
For new teams, and really for all teams in this period, being more aware and more purposeful about your communication is probably the most important thing. Being more aware of that someone might take it the wrong way, or letting people know, hey, this is what I think about it, but let me know. Let me know how you feel about it. Give me feedback on it. That's actually really important right now. And I think it's also, particularly with all of this uncertainty, it's very important for team leaders, but really for everyone on teams, to acknowledge that uncertainty to each other. And to really make that something that's allowable to talk about. Because Amy said it really nicely, that a fear that is shared is not the same as a fear that you hold inside, that you can't talk about with anybody.
Well, and especially getting at that
so I think
purpose that we were talking about, where part of your brain's whole job is to parse good from bad, certain from uncertain, et cetera. And so if you just share it, particularly, how you're feeling in a conversation or with your manager or with your colleagues, now you've shared it, you've taken away a huge part of the load that your brain was having to process, which was, I don't know how they are taking this. I don't know how I feel about this interaction. It's like, no, let's just have that discussion out in the open and spend our brain power solving the problem or assuaging the fear, right?
Yes, no, and I think that there's something about this sort of like Brady Bunch reality of everybody being on VCs all the time, and having these situations where, whether you're the VP or you're the intern, you're just another square on the screen. And like figuring out how to make that really work is super important. I mean, I think in some cases, some people maybe don't speak up because crosstalk is difficult. But I actually was just talking to someone from Dropbox earlier today, who was talking about quite a large team meeting where this was a virtual version of one that they have in person periodically. And he was saying that in this case, there was many more questions were being asked. There was much more interaction between people in the group and not just with the VP who was like leading the conversation. And I thought that was a very hopeful sign of how it is that we're learning how to do this. And yes, a lot of it is being a clear communicator, and a lot of it is really understanding the vulnerability that people have, and understanding your own vulnerability and being willing to share that vulnerability.
Yeah. One thing you were talking about is, obviously we're all on screens a lot these days. And I kind of want to dig in on that about, we hear, oh, it's too much screen time, or, oh, you need to get outside, or, oh, you need to go and change up your environment. But that can be really hard to do whenever you're working with a distributed team, or if you're working, global hours. And so you've got calls at 7 a.m. or at 9 p.m. at night, something like that. What is this kind of excess screen time doing to our brains, and how does that affect our attention? And is there anything that we should be doing to kind of make sure that we're keeping our brain balanced as we're doing more and more computer work?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. I mean, there's definitely a lot of research that being outside in nature of any kind, even simulations of nature, apparently are good for focus and for reducing stress. And this is something I'm actually really interested in researching, because my theory is that natural situations, although there's a lot of stuff going on, nature has an inherent order to it that our brains understand, because our brains are made out of that same order. So, as we know from computer graphics, you can generate a very realistic looking tree from not actually that many parameters, right? There it is, it sort of grows, and you can make a bunch of them, right? And so our brain is doing that. We sort of like look at a bunch of trees, and it's beautiful, but it also has this order to it, and this sort of like recursive order to it that we intuitively understand. And that's very calming. The ocean, Notion is like a perfect sort of example of that. But really just getting out into the world is very helpful, because, when you're in your house, I really think this whole situation that we're in is this very interesting sort of metaphor for the situation that we're in anyway, which is, you spend a lot of time, you're in your head, right? Whether you're in your computer screen or you're in your home, in your office, or whatever it is, you're kind of in your world, and you have to decide what to do, right? You have to say, what am I going to do next? What am I going to do next? So either you rely on everyone pinging you in order to tell you what to do, or, you can get into ruts and only work on certain things and not work on other things. And then all of a sudden you go outside, and whatever's going on out there, you're responding to that, so it's not all on you. Yeah. And I think I think the other thing to do is we've been making a point on our team of having sort of no reason meetings, just like one-on-one VCs like what we're having now, where there's no agenda, and it's really just allowing you to talk to someone else.
Yeah, we call those water coolers. I've got one in a couple hours actually, where it's like water cooler, keep it small, just chat about whatever's happening. It's actually a really nice break in the day, and simulates that kind of like different. Outside. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that one of the things that's really interesting is that not only are we on screens a lot, but we're on screens reading words a lot and talking. And, it's so much of what we're doing is language based. Unless you're a designer, you're very often not dealing, and maybe you're dealing with spreadsheets and there's like a lot of numbers or something like that. But most knowledge workers are spending most of their day with words. Yeah. And, just switching it up and drawing a diagram of something you're trying to work out. I have a whiteboard in my apartment, so I'm always sort of whiteboarding. And I think some of the video conference apps have whiteboard capabilities, and there's certainly different apps you can use that. But even, to use the Atlassian example, even to have a meeting with people and have a shared Trello board and have people be able to move things around, and for everyone to be able to interact with each other in this space. When I interviewed Barbara Tversky, who's a wonderful cognitive psychologist, and she's been doing research for 40 years on how people use maps and diagrams and gesture in order to communicate. And the point that she makes is, when you're working on something together, something that you all can see and something you can all add to, even a collaborative document does that too, because sometimes what you're adding to is the structure of it. It's not about the words, it's about you're adding like the structure, and everyone is kind of doing that together. Yeah. We have the sense that this is our work together. And then we get, all of that very nice, sort of neurochemical stuff that we get when we're all singing together. We get the kumbaya effect, right? Where you get the sense you're doing something with other people. Yeah. And that's a very comforting feeling. And it's very different than feeling like it's all on you. It takes some getting used to. It's not something that everyone knows how to do. It's actually a learned sort of what I call a social technology. It's sort of something we have to figure out how to do with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Anthony, this has been fascinating. I'm going to have to go look up all of these cognitive and behavioral scientists that you mentioned, because it sounds like their work is fascinating. But thank you so much for joining me. And if viewers would like to learn more about teamwork and collaboration, check out Atlassian.com and Dropbox.com. Anthony, thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Bye.